Hey, listen!
Leading up to the release for Fire Emblem Engage, the common sentiment online appeared that the game was looking to be overall an improvement over Three Houses. They were bringing back the weapon triangle, the graphics look like a substantial improvement, the UI looks a lot more understandable, even the hub area, the Somnia, was looking like a nice change of pace compared to what we saw in the monastery from Three Houses. Yet once reviews dropped last week, we saw a substantial difference in scores with Engage compared to Three Houses. Even though pretty much across the board, all of those reviews were saying that from a graphics, performance, and gameplay perspective the game was significantly better, many were complaining about the story. And it appears the story is the main reason why there's such a substantial difference in review scores between Three Houses and Engage. And after playing the game myself over the course of this weekend and seeing what people have said online about some translation discrepancies, and also hearing what others had to say on the voice acting, I have to wonder that maybe part of the reason why many are complaining about the story has to do with the localization efforts for this game. So are the localization efforts the reason the Fire Emblem Engage story has been disappointing for many? Well, that's what we're talking about today. Welcome everyone, this is On This Restart, and today we're going to be talking about Fire Emblem Engage and how the localization efforts for this game might have almost ruined the experience for this game. Now, full disclaimer, I say almost because I think the game is great. I've been enjoying it very much, and reviews have still been largely positive. As I said in my intro, most think that from a visual perspective, a performance perspective, and a gameplay perspective, the game is substantially better over Three Houses. It's a peak for the series, you could argue. However, story, which is something that many value, especially for the Fire Emblem series, seems to have taken a step back. And I've been enjoying the game myself, and I'm not entirely convinced that the story is terrible, but some seem to think it is, and it may have to do with how you've chosen to experience the game. Because when you jump into Fire Emblem Engage, first you have the option to change how you listen to the game. If you go into the settings, you can change it from either English or Japanese, and whether you want subtitles or not. And I think this can impact the game. Now, I'm an avid anime watcher, so I'm fairly comfortable with listening to shows in Japanese with English subtitles. I do this all the time. In fact, I pretty much across the board always prefer to listen to things in their original language. There are some occasional exceptions, but for the most part, this is what I prefer. And I think in general, this is usually the best way to go, because when you have a story that's written out, it's usually written from the perspective of its original language. So when you try and dub it with a different language, there's a few different challenges. One, there are some cultural barriers. There are simply some translation barriers where things may not translate perfectly in terms of concepts and sentences and things of that nature. But also trying to fit what was said initially with the original language into the same space of time with the new language when you're trying to sync the lips of a particular character, so that way there's not a mismatch there. And these are all challenges that, in my opinion, usually lead to the original language for a game or a movie or a show being the best way to go about it. Not always. Like I said, there are some exceptions. For example, I think actually Breath of the Wild, even though the story may not be amazing, I think is still pretty good in English. I actually like playing it in English. I've played it in Japanese and enjoyed it that way as well, but I wouldn't say I prefer it one way or the other. There are some exceptions. But with Fire Emblem, it does to me feel like a very anime-esque game. I think that's pretty obvious. So Japanese is something I definitely considered. I did play Three Houses initially in English, but I explored around with Japanese as well, and I thought that sounded cool then. So I decided this time around I would go and play the entire game from the beginning in Japanese. And I also went for the female version of Alear, because back in Three Houses I went for the male version of Byleth. Basically, I just decided to do things the opposite way because I wanted a little bit of variety. And I have actually enjoyed my experience of Engage across the board, even with the story. Now, I'm not trying to say the story is amazing. I think there are some things that are a little annoying. For example, Fram, her high-pitched, shrill voice kind of bothers me, regardless of whether it's in Japanese or in English. I've compared it, and I'm not in love with it, but it's okay. I think maybe in Japanese it's just a little bit more palatable. and I was trying to understand why, and what I realized after looking at what other people have had to say about comparisons of Japanese and English dubbings in general, what I've seen is that many think that in Japanese animes and shows, they tend to overact. But over there, that's not considered bad acting. That's considered something that matches the material. However, in the West, there's more of a focus on more realistic acting. But when it comes to anime, that doesn't quite work. With anime, it is meant to be more over the top, exaggerated. There's a reason they have the big eyes, because they want to exaggerate and evoke emotion. So when you have your story that's facilitating an anime direction, and it's something that would fit more of the anime Japanese dub style, then it lends itself more towards that. However, you have something that's going more towards the realistic side of things in terms of performances and such, perhaps a typical Western style approach to acting would still fit it pretty well. But anyways, I bring this up because I do speculate that maybe one of the reasons why people think lesser of the story has to do with which version they decide to play the game. Because I decided to play it in Japanese with female Alir, and I don't really mind my experience so far. It's been, for the most part, pretty good. Some minor things that aren't perfect, but still pretty good. And I'll say that one issue that I have noticed with the perhaps translations is that I can hear, even though I don't fully speak Japanese, I do understand some words here and there, but when I hear them speak in Japanese and refer to a particular character, and I hear them clearly say their name, but the translation of the dialogue doesn't show their name, there's a little bit of a mismatch there that takes away from my immersion just a little tiny bit, but it's nothing significant. I understand that there are challenges with translation. However, maybe there are bigger issues with the translation. And I actually saw this on Twitter the other day, and I felt like it was worth bringing up. So I saw this person tweeted, and I'll have the image here. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce the name, so I'm not going to try and butcher it. But they showed off two different side-by-side comparisons of the localization. And you have the dialogue in what I believe is Japanese, and there is clearly a difference in the characterization here. On one side, we made a good team coming up with this product together, I'm really grateful. That's the English localization, versus, I'm still a child, so I may not be ready for these sort of things. And then back in English, I got a memento of our great teamwork, so why shouldn't you? And then the other language, even if it's too soon for us to be lovers, we can still be partners, don't you think? And I don't think I need to continue on here. Main point is, there's a difference in characterization. However, this is something that I wouldn't consider necessarily bad, because depending on the culture, localization things need to be done. Like, they do not only just need to make sure that we understand the story exactly as it was intended, but also they need to make sure that the story and the dialogue matches and fits the aimed target ESRB rating or what have you, depending on the region, and also matching to the customs of where this game is being presented to. And that dialogue on the right doesn't suggest something appropriate at all. So I don't really have a problem with localization efforts like this. However, people have brought this up to suggest that maybe there were other parts of the game where the localization ruined the translation and perhaps impacted the story negatively. Now, I don't speak Japanese fluently at all. I don't speak it. I just understand a few occasional words because I watch a lot of anime. That's pretty much it. So I'm not trying to pretend like I have a full understanding of the language and I can tell when they're ruining and butchering the translation. I do not. But I also haven't seen too many people bring up other comparisons of the translations that are doing a terrible job. So until I see that, I'm not going to assume that they've done a terrible job of localizing the dialogue. I think just in some cases they need to change around the context of things because it may not fit quite well with the particular culture the game is being played in. So I'm not sure it's necessarily the translations itself that are causing issues, but I do think there is something to be said about the voice acting. Now, I don't also want to straight rip the voice acting either, because I'm not saying they're doing a bad job. I think for the most part, the actors are doing a solid job, but there's a difference between solid and passable versus good. And I'll say I compared the versions of male versus female Lear for the earlier scenes of the game Again, I've only played the first 5 chapters, so I didn't want to spoil myself. But there's still like almost 30 minutes of cutscenes there with the big, more high-budget ones. And there's a scene pretty early on into the game, but I'm not going to say exactly what happens because I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't seen that part yet. But there are tears shed, someone dies, it's a big deal. Listening to the female version, I actually was emotionally choked up, but that was when I listened to it in Japanese. And then when I listened to it in English, the male version, I didn't think it was like abysmal, but it wasn't great either. It was just pretty much just passable to me, serviceable. And then when I listened to the female version in English, I was like, oh, okay, this kind of fits a little bit more. Now, I'm biased, this is my subjective opinion. Maybe I simply feel that the female version of Alear fits the context of the story a little bit better, and that relationship with that particular character seems to make a bit more sense to me. But that is my opinion, but I wouldn't be shocked if many also share a similar opinion. I have seen others say that they're not really entirely in love with Alear, but when I asked them which version they picked, they told me they picked male, but I picked the female version, and I think it works pretty well actually. I wouldn't say that the female Alear is one of the lesser parts of the voice acting in this game. I actually think it's one of the stronger parts in the game, and I think it's pretty good. And I actually like the characterization of Alear. She has a little bit more personality. I know with Fire Emblem they kind of try to go with a little bit of a character that's kind of like a blank slate, so you can kind of assume your own personality into it. But with this character, I actually think she has a good personality. I'm glad that they gave her some personality, or him, depending on which version you play. And I actually think it's pretty good. The female version, at least. English or Japanese. The male version, I wouldn't say it's amazing. I think it's just okay. And that's really just based off how I think the character is being depicted and how it fits with the story and the world. I'm not trying to say the voice actor himself has done a bad job. As someone who used to act, I'll say that oftentimes it isn't the actor itself that is acting poorly. I think sometimes the direction and the circumstances they're put in may cast them in a bad light, and how they're directed and what they're trying to perform as may not fit with the scenes that are being shown to the audience. So maybe that's the issue here with male Alear, and maybe that's in part why a lot of people feel so negative about the story. Again, I haven't played the whole game, so I can't offer up my full conclusive opinion on it, but from, I would say, a decent sample size of the game so far, I am noticing that it seems that if you pick maybe Japanese, or if you go with the female version of Alear, you're probably going to have a slightly better experience of the story. That's my perspective. I'm sure some of you may disagree or have other opinions on it, so please share that with me in the comments below. But anyways everyone, this is On This Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.